And somewhere along the way, there's usually a footprint measurement exercise of some sort. But then, there does come that point where people are wondering what comes next. And sometimes at that point, the real question is whether or not the way that they put that footprint measurement together on their water, air, gas, electricity, steam, whether or not that's actually being put together in a way that would allow them to look more closely at their own operation to see whether or not there's any patterns that would indicate waste or opportunities to optimize the operation to be a bit more resource efficient. And I think part of the reason things stall is because the way that those initial measurements are done tends to be very financially focused. The use of billing information in very aggregated counts and flows in terms of the actual resources. And there's a lot of perceptions out there that getting more detailed information can be both challenging and expensive. And without getting into all the details of why it's actually not quite as difficult as it seems, we would just want to make the statement that generally speaking, it's not necessarily that hard or even terribly expensive to get much more granular information. Probably the bigger challenge is that whether it's meter data, whether it's extracting information from the automation systems that are running your equipment, that data, when it comes out in its raw form, isn't necessarily useful all on its own. And I think one of the things that then gets lost is the issue of being able to support more than one kind of user. Your engineering and electrical teams might understand what the sensors are saying, but that information may be coming out in a way that doesn't necessarily make it that easy to share with a product designer, a process optimization team, a continuous improvement leader, or a sustainability officer who may be looking to make it a bit easier to provide more transparency to customers and regulators. But in an ideal world, you would still want a single pool of data that has somehow been put together in a way that everybody can work from, rather than having isolated investments in tools and in the approaches to using the data in those different tools. So I guess from our view, we'd say that this really translates to more, in some respects, of a data management and presentation issue. If we accept that collection is relatively easy in the sense that smart sensors and automation platforms tend to be pretty open, so the issue isn't simply to get what those devices can tell us, the issue is to have that land in a place that can be made accessible and useful for a lot of other people than just the technical teams who understand the assets and processes in the first place. So let's think about this as a usability problem. Whatever solutions I need to put in, they've got to be able to do a few things for me. The first of which is to get me away from the notion of having a meter that represents some sort of consumption information. It's really critical to make sure that that meter is understood in the context of a particular asset or process or area of an operation, and that that's presented in a way that's intuitive and easy for anybody to understand. Similarly, the way the data is presented, especially if you're trying to take advantage of existing investments in automation and technology, you will find that there are lots of data streams available, but they may not necessarily present them in ways that make it easy for somebody to understand consumption over a period of time, or even, frankly, a snapshot of a current rate. And so with that in mind, part of the key then becomes to make sure that if I have different ways of measuring the same thing, water flow, gas flow, current consumption rate of electricity in a given area, that even if the underlying automation or metering that's presenting that information does so a little bit differently in different locations, when I'm feeding that out to different stakeholders, they need to see it in a way so that they can compare one functionally identical area or conceptually identical area to another without getting bogged down in the issues of the particular way that the technology under the bonnet measured that information in the first place. And then I think the final thing is to get away from this notion of reporting and think about exploration. There's an awful lot of dashboards we've seen over the years where a snapshot in time is taken that represents a period of consumption and a total set of figures and maybe even a cost index, but that's what you get is that snapshot. And if you're going to be looking for ways to understand whether or not your current consumption rates in these different areas are just as good as you can be, so with that in mind, I want to put a little bit of a focus on one of the solutions that we use in areas where there can be different types of sensors or automation making data available And then our job is to find a way of putting a presentation layer on top of it that supports these three kinds of behaviors. So as part of our arsenal, we've got a solution called Operations Hub, comes from our partner called GE Digital. And I'm going to use a few example screens that one of our solutions engineers has put together to get some of our customers a bit of a running start in precisely this area, which will illustrate how we can use that kind of solution to address these three key requirements that we've laid out here. And without, again, getting too bogged down in the technical details, I simply want to make the couple of attributes of the solution fairly understandable. It's highly connectable, so this notion that it can speak to a lot of different devices through a number of different languages or protocols. All right, so moving over to our presentation or demonstration system here. I'm not going to go through everything that might be available in the system. There's just a few key things that I wanted to illustrate. And in fact, the starting screen I've got here is one that is probably not atypical of the kinds of things that people may have seen already on some of the corporate sustainability dashboards, or even just frankly some of the Excel-based charts or PowerPoint-based charts that are pretty commonly put up on the entry areas to different facilities, so people can at least have a sense of what the aggregate performance has looked like at a given moment. But I think for me, one of the things that's interesting is we started there with a view that was just around particular resource types, right? We were looking at electricity, we were looking at water usage, we were looking at compressed air and the like. And again, if I'm getting an invoice from my utility supplier or a gas vendor, it's really easy to put that total cost picture perspective together, but it's not necessarily as useful as being able to drill into the different areas within an operation and be able to see what's going on within that particular spot. So using the ability of the solution we're working with here, Operations Hub, to construct a model that reflects the structure of an organization, and both in terms of its corporation, but also in terms of the different areas within a particular facility, and even down to the individual process line or asset level, is probably one of the key things in helping people understand how that overall cost breaks down into the way particular areas may or may not have variability that can still be controlled. So in very simple terms, I've got this ability to take that model and then begin mapping the subsets or the substreams of the different types of resource data and see how things are being used or in a particular area of this facility. And that, I think, is probably one of the first things that can be interesting, is just for people to see that kind of breakdown so that they can begin to get a sense of what are the heavy hitters. And a way that may be a little more interesting than a pie chart might actually be to take a look at something from more of a heat map perspective. So someone can see here that I've got, miscellaneous doesn't seem to consume a ton of the different resources that I'm using here in my operation. But I can see that, the brew house certainly does seem to be an area where, steam gets consumed a fair bit. And if I, again, take this notion of having categorized the consumption types as well as the areas of the facility, again, I've given my users a nice way of being able to browse through the different data types that are available and see how different resources are consumed in different areas of the plant. So far, so good, and I might construct all of this with nothing more than some fairly raw data streams and that basic model that I've spoken about. But one of the other things that a solution like Operations Hub can let us do is bring in other types of data to inform some of the calculations or the presentations we might want to do. And that might mean, for example, being able to put some cost indexing information under the bonnet as well, so that if I have changes in the rate that I'm paying for different resources over time, and I can then relate those to the streams that are coming in, then suddenly I'm now in a position to build this kind of heat map with an understanding not just of the overall consumption into an area, but potentially I can take that cost allocation and even set up a budget for it, and then begin to do a little bit of basic variance analysis. So this kind of finger on the pulse heat map for the way that the resources are being consumed in different plant areas is now no longer simply a case of, well, what area has a higher number than another area. This can be highlighting spots where I've got a variation against my budget based on having both cost indexed the information that's coming in, but then also put in some sense of a target which reflects some kind of standard that may have been agreed between the plant operations and the engineering team at some point as being reasonable for that particular part of the facility. And again, what this is helping me do is understand where there may be priority areas worth investigating. So it's not necessarily that the case that all the answers are here, but what I'm doing is now narrowing my focus on looking for the things to control that are worth controlling. And then we talked a little bit about exploration as well. And so I do also want to jump into this notion of, aside from that finger on the pulse or the snapshot, giving people an ability to get a sense of how things perform over time. And again, you can see here that we've taken this notion of our enterprise model, and we can pre-build the kind of view that makes it easy for somebody to see performance trends. And again, here what we've also done is put those up against a budget or a standard within that area so that it's at a fingertip. I can present the kind of view that makes it easy for somebody to see how their performance has been over a period of time, not just in terms of the raw consumption, but in terms of a comparison against a standard. And so again, quite useful for somebody to see whether or not there's variation that seems to be persistent. And you can see here in this particular case, if I look at the usage of water against small pack, I'm actually doing reasonably well against my target, because for a good chunk of the time frame that I'm evaluating for, I'm under it. But then you can see there may be other areas where I am coming up above my target periodically. And again, if I've got that ability to look over a longer period, as well as see what looks like a reasonable standard, I'm getting a sense of whether or not these might be priority areas to investigate, whether some sort of process control or asset tuning effort may actually help me stay within my budget range and within my consumption ranges more effectively. And I think the final thing that I wanted to highlight is that issue of further exploration. So far, the kinds of things I've shown had been very much pre-built. And at this point, what I wanted to do was illustrate that it's not just the provenance of engineers to be able to sit down and say, I'm not quite sure what I'm looking for, but I'd like to be able to browse through all of the information that's available to me and see whether or not something leaps out. And again, what I've done here is I've used the Operations Hub solution to put that model in place and then to present normal human language ways of understanding the different metrics that I can go hunting through. And this is the kind of exploration tool that I can put in front of any kind of user. They don't have to be highly technical. Pretty much anybody within, my example facility here would be able to say things like, hey, I'm interested in exploring electricity consumption. I'd like to look at a particular area of the facility to see how that consumption pattern has looked over a given period of time. And as you might expect, I'd like some control over what period of time I'm evaluating, because it may be interesting to me to see whether or not a short-term pattern is one that looks like it persists over a longer period, and indeed to see whether or not there's actually a pattern in the data, whether or not I seem to go through periods of relatively steady behavior, punctuated by periods where things may go a little haywire compared to what I thought I would expect to see. So I think I want to put a line under the video here at this point and simply say that I hope this has given people an understanding that if they've been asking themselves what's next after the initial steps in their sustainability journey, that this kind of thinking and this kind of approach may actually make it easier for them to see how they can begin to capture data that's likely already largely being generated within their facilities, but more importantly, package that and present it in ways that helps people understand where the areas of priority may be, and then do enough of an exploration to be able to get a sense of what the size of opportunity of optimizing a process, changing a recipe, possibly even looking at equipment refurbishment or overhaul, may actually yield in terms of an improvement in the consumption of electricity, water, or other resource inputs. Thanks very much.